I am Sasha, 32 years old, and I just attended the most expensive disaster of a wedding in my family history. I was sitting quietly at my brother Andre's reception when my older sister Vanessa dragged a very powerful man over to my table. She pointed right at me and laughed, telling her boss Julian that I was the jobless failure of the family, a parasite still living off our parents' money. I took a slow sip of my champagne and smiled. Julian looked at me with deep respect, turned to my sister, and said with ice-cold precision, "You are fired." Before I tell you how a single glass of spilled wine led to my family losing absolutely everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to put toxic family members in their place. The reception was held at a prestigious country club in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers, imported orchids, and a $150,000 price tag. Naturally, my parents sat me at a tiny table near the kitchen doors. I was minding my own business when my new sister-in-law, Courtney, sashayed over. Courtney is white, comes from what she claims is old money, and has made it her personal mission to remind our African-American family how lucky we are to have her. She constantly made passive-aggressive comments about our neighborhood, our traditions, and especially my lack of a high-paying corporate job. She loved parading her designer handbags around, making sure everyone knew how much they cost. Without warning, she stumbled. A full glass of dark Cabernet splashed directly down the front of my silk dress. "Oh my gosh," Courtney gasped, though her eyes were gleaming with malice. "I am so sorry, Sasha, but do not worry. I am sure that thrift store rag only cost you $10 anyway. It will wash right out." My mother Renee was standing right there. Instead of handing me a napkin, she patted Courtney on the arm and told her not to stress on her special day. This was the dynamic in our household. Courtney was the prize. Vanessa was the corporate star, Andre was the golden boy groom, and I was the embarrassment they hid in the corner. I did not yell. I simply dabbed at the stain while watching Vanessa parade Julian Pierce around the room. Julian was the CEO of a massive tech firm where Vanessa was vice president of marketing. She had been bragging about bringing him to the wedding for months. She wanted to show him she came from elite stock. That is when she dragged him to my table, eager to make a joke out of my supposedly unemployed status. Julian did not even raise his voice. He simply adjusted his tie, looked Vanessa directly in the eyes, and told her to pack up her desk by Monday morning. When Julian fired her on the spot, the entire ballroom seemed to freeze. Vanessa stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then she lost her mind. She lunged forward, slamming her hands on my table so hard the silverware rattled. "You little tramp!" Vanessa screamed, her face contorted with rage. "How did you do this? You must be sleeping with him. You threw yourself at my boss because you are jealous of my career." The music stopped. Guests turned to stare. My father Calvin stormed over, his face flushed with fury. He did not ask what happened. He immediately pointed a finger at my face. "Sasha, you are a disgrace to this family," Calvin shouted. He had always favored Vanessa and Andre, paying for their expensive private universities while forcing me to take out loans for state college. Now he was taking their side again without even asking for the truth. "This is your brother's big day, and you are causing a scene because you cannot handle your sister being successful," he yelled. "Get your things and get out of here right now." I looked at my father. I looked at Courtney smirking in her custom white gown. I looked at Vanessa sobbing dramatically into our mother's shoulder. None of them asked why Julian Pierce, a billionaire CEO, would take orders from me. They just assumed the worst, because they always assumed the worst of me. I stood up slowly. I picked up my clutch and smoothed down my wine-stained dress. "I will not be apologizing," I said calmly, "and I am definitely leaving." I caught the eye of the venue manager, a nervous-looking man in a sharp suit who had been hovering near the kitchen doors. I gave him a subtle nod. He looked down at his tablet and hurried away. My father crossed his arms, looking victorious. "Do not bother coming to Sunday dinner either," Calvin spat. "You are cut off. You need to learn how to survive without my bank account backing you up." I smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said, stepping past him. "It is definitely time for a financial reality check. I am freezing the family account tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone." I walked out of the ballroom holding my head high. The cool night air felt refreshing against my skin as I handed the valet my ticket. I climbed into the back of my waiting car and told my driver to head home. We were barely 5 miles down the highway when my phone started ringing frantically. It was Andre. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Sasha, what did you do?" Andre shouted into the phone. The background noise sounded like absolute chaos. I could hear Courtney crying hysterically in the distance. "I did exactly what Dad asked," I replied smoothly. I left the party. The venue manager just pulled Dad aside. Andre panicked, his voice cracking. Dad tried to pay the $50,000 catering bill with his black card, and it declined. The manager tried it 4 times. "The account is completely frozen, and they are saying if we do not wire the funds immediately, they are going to arrest me for theft of services. You have to call the bank, Sasha." I leaned back against the leather seat of my car, listening to my golden child brother beg for my help. For years, they had treated me like a parasite, completely unaware that the money funding their luxury lifestyle actually belonged to the daughter they despised. "I am sorry, Andre," I said softly. "Dad told me to stop living off the family money, so I took my money back." I ended the call and blocked his number, ready to watch their entire world crumble. I tapped the glass partition dividing the front and back of the luxury sedan. My driver slowed the car immediately. The plush leather of the back seat was comfortable, and the quiet hum of the engine was soothing. But realizing my family was about to face the consequences of their own actions was a show I simply could not miss. I asked the driver to pull back around to the country club entrance. I stepped out of the car and walked through the heavy oak doors into the main lobby. The scene unfolding near the reception desk was absolute chaos. Courtney was standing in the center of the marble floor, clutching the skirt of her custom white gown. Her perfect bridal makeup was completely ruined by dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. She was screaming at Andre at the top of her lungs, throwing a massive tantrum about her perfect day being destroyed. She pointed a manicured finger at my brother, blaming his ghetto family for embarrassing her in front of her wealthy relatives. Andre looked like he was going to be sick. He was sweating profusely, tugging at the collar of his tuxedo and looking frantically at the venue manager who stood nearby with 2 uniformed police officers. My father Calvin was aggressively tapping his black card against the front desk, demanding the receptionist run it again. When he spotted me walking through the lobby doors, his expression immediately shifted from panic to rage. He marched right up to me, not bothering to ask why I had returned. He pointed at my phone and ordered me to call the bank right now and fix this glitch. He hissed that I was embarrassing them in front of Courtney and her entire family. I did not reach for my phone. I simply stood there watching the panic set into his eyes. Andre rushed over, grabbing my arm and begging me to do something. He said the police were going to arrest him for felony theft of services if the $50,000 catering bill was not settled immediately. I gently removed his hand from my arm. I looked at my father and asked him if he remembered what happened 6 years ago. I reminded him of the day his construction firm went completely under, the day he filed for bankruptcy and nearly lost the house. I asked if he remembered how miraculously an anonymous angel investor trust swept in, paid off his remaining debts, and issued him a black card with a $50,000 monthly limit. Calvin scoffed, puffing out his chest. He loudly declared that the trust was a secret family inheritance left by my grandfather. He said it was money meant for the rightful head of the family. I shook my head slowly. I told him grandfather left us absolutely nothing but medical debt and a second mortgage. I explained that there was no secret family inheritance. I set up that anonymous trust. I funded that black card with the payout from my very first successful tech buyout. I looked right into his eyes and told him the cold, hard truth. For the past 6 years, he, my mother, Vanessa, and Andre had been living entirely off my money. The color completely drained from my father's face. He looked down at the black card in his hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. Andre stepped back, his mouth hanging open in pure shock. My mother, Renee, who had been hovering near Courtney, finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She marched over to me, her face twisted in defensive anger. She screamed that it did not matter whose name was on the account. She yelled that they had raised me, fed me, and paid for my tuition at that cheap state college, so I owed them every single dime on that card. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened a digital file I had kept saved for over a decade. I held the screen up right in front of her face. It was a scanned bank statement from the joint college savings account she and my father had managed. I read the transaction history out loud. I pointed out that they did not pay a single dime for my college education. The statement clearly showed they drained all $30,000 from my college fund the exact day I turned 18. They used my entire future to buy Vanessa a luxury Mercedes for her graduation present. I looked my mother dead in the eye and told her I worked double shifts at a greasy diner for 4 years to pay my own tuition while they drove around in my stolen education. Renee opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The absolute silence in the lobby was deafening. I looked at Andre, then back to my father. I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the trust management portal. With one swift motion, I pressed the button to permanently cancel the black card. The account was closed. The venue manager, who had been listening to the entire exchange, gave a sharp nod to the two police officers. They stepped forward immediately, grabbing Andre by the arms and twisting them behind his back. The loud click of the metal handcuffs echoing against the marble walls sent a shockwave through the room. Andre started screaming, begging our father to do something to stop them. Courtney backed away in absolute horror, pressing her hands against her mouth as she watched her new husband being treated like a common criminal on their wedding night. Just as the officers began to pull Andre toward the lobby exit, the heavy glass doors opened again. Courtney's wealthy parents stepped through the crowd. Her father, a prominent real estate developer, took one look at the police, the crying bride, and the handcuffed groom. He did not ask what happened. He pulled a checkbook from his tailored suit jacket. He looked at Calvin and Andre with a gaze of pure, unfiltered disgust. He told the police officers to wait, stating he would pay the venue directly to avoid the ultimate humiliation of having his daughter's new husband dragged out in handcuffs in front of their elite guests. I simply turned around, walked back to my waiting car, and left them to deal with their new reality. 2 days had passed since the spectacle of my brother's wedding, and the silence in my penthouse was glorious. I sat sipping espresso, watching the sun reflect off the skyline. My phone was not vibrating with entitled requests. Cutting off the anonymous trust was like severing a rotten branch. The fallout had been spectacular, but I knew my family would try to find another way to survive. I scanned the latest financial reports for my venture capital firm. Everything was green and under my absolute control. I was about to run when my cell phone lit up with a FaceTime request from Andre. I let it ring, admiring the panicked expression on his caller ID before calmly pressing accept. "Sasha, you need to fix this right now." Andre did not bother with a greeting. His face filled the screen, red and sweaty. Behind him, I could see the exclusive first-class check-in counter for the airline supposed to fly them to their $30,000 honeymoon in Bora Bora. Courtney was standing next to him, wearing an oversized sun hat and a silk outfit. She was tapping her foot aggressively, glaring at the gate agent behind the counter. "What exactly do you want me to fix, Andre?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "The tickets," he hissed, looking around nervously. "The agent is saying our confirmation numbers are invalid. The flights, the overwater bungalow, everything is canceled. Dad told me you froze the trust, but these tickets were booked months ago. You cannot do this to us." I took a deliberate sip of my espresso, letting him sweat. "Andre," I said softly, "you really do not pay attention to how your luxury life is funded, do you? Those tickets were booked through my corporate travel concierge service, a perk tied directly to the black card account. When I terminated the trust and revoked the card, all pending reservations linked to that account were automatically canceled. The airline refunded the money to me yesterday." Courtney must have heard my voice through the speaker because she shoved her face into the frame. Her flawless bridal glow was gone, replaced by a mask of furious entitlement. "Listen to me, you vindictive little brat!" Courtney snapped, pointing a finger at the camera. "You are going to call this airline and rebook our first-class seats right this second. My father paid off your ridiculous catering bill, but he is not paying for my honeymoon. We are going to Bora Bora, and you are going to pay for it, or I swear I will make sure you are never allowed at another social event again." I could not help but laugh. It was a deep laugh that echoed in my quiet living room. "Courtney," I said, leaning closer to the camera, "you still do not get it, do you? There is no family money. There is no secret trust fund. There is only my money. The money I earned building a tech empire while your new husband spent his days pretending to be an executive. Andre is broke. My parents are completely broke. They do not even own the house they sleep in. You married a grown man who needs his little sister to pay for his plane tickets." The silence that followed was absolute perfection. I watched the realization wash over Courtney's face. Her eyes widened, darting from the phone screen to Andre. She looked at her new husband, the man she thought was her golden ticket to endless luxury, and saw him for exactly what he was, a terrified broke fraud. Andre tried to reach for her hand. "Courtney, baby, please, we can figure this out," he stammered. "I can get a loan. I can talk to my dad." "Do not touch me!" Courtney shrieked, slapping his hand away so violently that several passengers turned to stare. "You lied to me. You and your entire pathetic family lied to me. You told me you were old money. You told me you were vice president of a logistics firm. You are nothing but a broke loser living off your sister." She did not hesitate. Courtney grabbed the handle of her massive luxury suitcase and yanked it away from the luggage cart. She looked at Andre with a mixture of absolute disgust and pure hatred. "I am going back to my parents' house," she declared loudly, making sure everyone at the ticket counter heard her. "Do not even think about following me. I am calling my father's lawyers the second I get in the taxi, and we are getting this sham of a marriage annulled before the ink even dries." She turned on her heel and marched toward the airport exit, leaving Andre standing alone at the first-class counter. He looked completely devastated, staring at the retreating back of his bride. He slowly looked back down at the phone screen, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sasha, please," he whispered, his voice completely broken. "She is leaving me. I have nothing. Please just book the flights. I will pay you back, I swear." I looked at my brother, feeling absolutely no pity for the man who had spent his entire life participating in my daily humiliation. "Welcome to the real world, Andre," I said softly. "Try not to miss the bus home." I tapped the red button, ending the call, and plunging my living room back into peaceful silence. The golden boy was finally getting a taste of reality, and the gold-digging bride had shown her true colors at the very first sign of financial struggle. I took a deep breath, ready to finally enjoy my morning coffee. But my peace was incredibly short-lived. Before I could even set my coffee cup down, my secure tablet pinged with an urgent priority notification. It was a direct message from the lead attorney of my elite legal team. I opened the encrypted file, scanning the legal document attached. Vanessa was not going down without a fight. Instead of accepting her termination, she had just filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Julian Pierce and his tech company. The charges were severe. She was claiming discrimination, wrongful termination, and emotional distress, alleging that she was fired solely because she uncovered a scandalous affair between her billionaire boss and her mentally unstable, unemployed sister. The war had just begun. The morning sun was barely hitting the skyline when my phone buzzed with an alert. I turned on the television in my living room and switched to the most popular national morning talk show. There, sitting on a plush white sofa next to a sympathetic host, was Vanessa. She wore a modest pastel dress and minimal makeup, perfectly crafted to look like a heartbroken victim. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue while the camera zoomed in on her face. The host leaned in, placing a comforting hand on her knee. The banner running across the bottom of the screen read, "Corporate Corruption and Family Betrayal." The host asked her to explain why a successful vice president of marketing had been abruptly fired from her prestigious tech firm. Vanessa took a shaky breath and launched into the most elaborate lie I had ever heard. She claimed she was a corporate whistleblower. She told the millions of viewers watching across the country that she uncovered a scandalous and deeply inappropriate affair between her, billionaire chief executive officer Julian Pierce, and her own sister. She painted a picture of me that was completely unrecognizable. She described me as her mentally unstable and chronically unemployed younger sister who was manipulating a wealthy man. Vanessa claimed she tried to confront Julian about the ethical violations of sleeping with the vulnerable sibling of his subordinate and was immediately terminated to cover up the scandal. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was setting the stage for her multi-million-dollar wrongful termination and discrimination lawsuit by destroying my reputation on national television. I did not throw anything at the screen. I simply took a sip of my coffee and memorized every single defamatory word she spoke. A sudden, aggressive pounding on my front door interrupted the broadcast. I walked across the hardwood floor and checked the security monitor. It was my father, Calvin, and my mother, Renee. They were pacing furiously in the hallway outside my luxury condo. I unlocked the door and they barged inside without waiting for an invitation. They did not even bother to wipe their expensive shoes on the welcome mat, leaving faint scuff marks on the immaculate flooring. Calvin was clutching a thick stack of legal documents in his hand. He marched directly into my living room, completely ignoring the expensive art and custom furniture I had paid for myself. He slammed the papers down onto my marble kitchen island. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that I sit down and sign every single page immediately. I glanced at the documents. They were sworn affidavits drafted by the sleazy attorney representing Vanessa. The papers required me to legally confess to having an illicit affair with Julian Pierce. It also required me to state that I had manipulated Julian into firing Vanessa out of petty sibling jealousy. Renee stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. She demanded, "I pick up a pen and do this one thing right for my family." She screamed that the career of Vanessa was temporarily ruined, and this lawsuit was her only chance to secure a massive settlement that would take care of all of them. Calvin chimed in, insisting that since I did not have a real career or a reputation to protect, it would not matter if the public thought I was a gold-digging mistress, he said. I owed it to Vanessa after ruining the wedding night for Andre. They were standing in my home, a home they thought I rented with their money, demanding I commit perjury to make my sister rich. They truly believed I was a worthless pawn, existing only to be sacrificed for their golden children. I did not yell or argue. I calmly walked over to my espresso machine and began preparing 2 fresh cups of coffee. The rich smell of roasted beans filled the tense air. Renee shrieked, asking if I was deaf or just incredibly stupid. I ignored her insults. I carefully placed the 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the island right next to their ridiculous affidavits. Then I opened a drawer and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. I slid it across the smooth marble surface until it touched the hand of my father. He snatched it up, tearing the flap open with trembling fingers, expecting to see a signed check. I told them to read the contents before they took another breath. Calvin ripped open the envelope. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter drafted by my elite corporate legal team. I explained in a perfectly level voice that if Vanessa did not publicly retract her defamatory statements within 24 hours, my lawyers would bury her in a countersuit that would leave her bankrupt for the rest of her natural life. I told them perjury is a federal crime, and I would absolutely not be signing their fairy tale confession. Renee lost what little sanity she had left. She swiped her hand across the counter, knocking both coffee mugs onto the floor. The ceramic shattered, sending hot liquid splashing across the pristine white tiles. She screamed that I was an ungrateful monster who was dead to her. She told me I had no idea what family loyalty meant, and that I was going to pay dearly for my selfishness. She got right in my face and leveled her ultimate threat. Renee declared she was calling her real estate agent the moment she left my building. She threatened to immediately sell the large childhood home where I grew up. She claimed she would liquidate every single family asset and leave me with absolutely zero inheritance so that when I inevitably failed at life, I would have nowhere to run and nowhere to sleep. She smiled a cruel, bitter smile, thinking she held the ultimate trump card over my head. She told me I would end up begging on the streets. I did not flinch. I did not even look at the shattered mugs. I leaned against the marble counter, crossing my arms. I looked at my mother and let a calm smile spread across my face. "You cannot sell that house." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice quiet, "you do not own it anymore. I bought the foreclosed mortgage 3 years ago. I am legally your landlord. Now kindly leave my property." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. Renee stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and sheer panic. Calvin shook his head, his face turning an angry crimson as he flatly refused to accept what I had just told them. He slammed his hand against the marble island, demanding that I stop telling lies. He shouted that a private investment firm had purchased their debt to save the estate. I nodded slowly, taking a calm sip of my coffee. I told him he was right about the private investment firm, but completely wrong about who owned it. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. I slid it across the counter. I told Calvin to open it and read the name on the property deed. He snatched the folder and flipped through the pages. He found the signature page and froze. The investment firm that had bailed them out of bankruptcy was registered under a corporation completely owned by me. I watched the realization wash over his face as he stared at my signature, perfectly legible, at the bottom of the page. I explained that, when they defaulted on their loans, I stepped in and bought the debt in cash. I knew if they realized I held their mortgage, they would demand to live there for free. So I used a shell company to act as their landlord, forcing them to pay me rent every single month under the disguise of a restructured bank loan. Renee gripped the edge of the counter, looking like she was going to collapse. She whispered that it was impossible, that I was just a bitter, unemployed failure. She accused me of forging the documents just to hurt them. Calvin did not share her delusion. He knew a legally binding contract when he saw one. His shock morphed into a terrifying rage. The illusion of his fake wealth had just been completely shattered by the daughter he constantly belittled. He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy folder off the counter. He shouted that he would not let a disrespectful brat hold his home hostage, declaring he was going to tear the deed into pieces. I did not flinch as he ripped the first page. I calmly informed him that those were just copies, and the originals were secured in a bank vault downtown. Calvin dropped the torn paper and took a threatening step around the island. He stepped directly into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. He ordered me to sign the property over to his name immediately. Before he could take another step, a massive figure stepped out from the shadowed hallway of my condo. Marcus, my private security detail, moved with terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly between me and my father, placing a massive hand directly onto Calvin's chest. Marcus did not raise his voice, but his tone carried a dangerous warning as he advised my father to step back immediately. Calvin froze, staring up at the security guard who had appeared out of nowhere. Renee let out a frightened gasp, backing away toward the front door. I looked past Marcus and told my parents that their lease was officially under review and that they needed to vacate my condo. Calvin tried to maintain his pride, muttering threats under his breath, but he did not dare challenge Marcus. He grabbed Renee tightly by the arm, and they hurried out the door, fleeing my home just like trespassing criminals. Hours passed as the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long, dark shadows across my living room. Just after midnight, a heavy and incredibly desperate knocking echoed from my front door. I checked the security monitor and clearly saw Andre standing in the hallway. He was wearing a rumpled gray hoodie and he looked absolutely miserable. I opened the door and Andre practically fell inside. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and begged me to let him crash on my couch. He explained that Courtney had completely lost her mind after the airport disaster. When she realized I was telling the truth about the frozen family money, she went on a rampage. She threw all of his expensive personal belongings onto the front lawn and loudly told him she was filing for an annulment first thing in the morning. Courtney's father had threatened to call the police immediately if Andre ever dared to set foot on their property again. Andre was now homeless and absolutely terrified that the catering vendors were still going to press criminal charges against him for the unpaid wedding bill. I looked at my golden child brother standing in my hallway with nothing to his name. He was shivering, crying about his perfect life being ripped away. I decided to play the long game. I stepped aside and told him he could sleep on the sofa for one night, but he had to be gone by morning. Andre collapsed with relief, thanking me as he trudged into the living room and threw himself onto the cushions. By the time I walked back through the living room, Andre was completely passed out, snoring heavily. He had dropped his expensive tablet on the glass coffee table right next to his head. The screen faced upward, illuminating the dark room with a soft glow. I was about to walk past when a notification chimed. The screen lit up, displaying an urgent email alert. I paused, narrowing my eyes at the banner. It was an alert from an offshore banking application confirming a massive wire transfer. I stepped closer, leaning over the table to read the full notification. The alert detailed a transfer of $250,000. The money was being moved directly from the corporate accounts of the construction firm owned by Courtney's father. The destination was a hidden offshore account, but the contact email belonged to Andre. My breathing slowed as the pieces clicked. Andre was not just a spoiled groom living off my stolen money. He had been actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his wealthy father-in-law to fund his luxury lifestyle and keep up with Courtney's materialistic demands. I stared at my sleeping brother, realizing I had just discovered the ultimate weapon to destroy the last remaining shred of his golden reputation. I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, feeling a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. The numbers were right there in black and white, documenting a massive felony. $250,000 siphoned from a legitimate commercial construction company and funneled directly into a hidden offshore account. I did not feel any shock or surprise. I only felt a deep sense of validation. My golden child brother was not just a spoiled parasite who lived off his sister. He was a desperate corporate criminal who was actively stealing from his new wife and her family. I picked up the tablet, feeling the sleek, cold metal casing in my hand. Andre was snoring loudly on my custom velvet sofa, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire house of cards had just violently collapsed. I walked around the glass coffee table and stood directly over him. I looked down at his relaxed face. I did not gently shake him awake or call his name. I simply let go of the tablet. The heavy device dropped squarely onto his chest with a loud, heavy thud. Andre gasped violently and jerked awake. His hands flew to his chest as he tried to figure out where he was and what was happening. He blinked against the dim ambient light of the living room, looking up at me with panicked, bloodshot eyes. He rubbed his face and mumbled a confused greeting, asking why I hit him with his device in the middle of the night. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I kept my tone dead flat and instructed him to unlock the screen and look at what he had done. He fumbled with the tablet, his hands visibly shaking from sleep and mounting stress. The moment his eyes focused on the offshore transfer notification, all the remaining color completely drained from his face. He looked like a cornered animal. He quickly hit the power button, plunging the screen into darkness, but he knew it was entirely too late. He started stammering out pathetic, frantic excuses. He claimed it was a simple misunderstanding regarding a complex corporate bonus structure that I simply did not understand. He tried to tell me it was a perfectly legitimate business transaction, fully approved by his father-in-law to fund a new real estate venture. I crossed my arms and looked down at him with unfiltered disgust. I told him he was a terrible liar and a pathetic excuse for a businessman. I pointed out that legitimate corporate bonuses are not wired to untraceable offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands at 2 in the morning. I told him I knew exactly what he was doing. He was bleeding his wealthy father-in-law dry to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle and keep his gold-digging bride happy. Andre broke down completely. He dropped his face into his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The pathetic, wet sounds echoed in my immaculate living room. He confessed everything right then and there. He sobbed that Courtney demanded a life he could never afford on his own. She wanted the vintage imported sports cars, the exclusive country club memberships, the custom designer wardrobes, and the endless luxury vacations to private islands. He said the pressure of maintaining the illusion was constantly suffocating him. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and actually tried to shift the blame onto our parents. He told me Calvin and Renee spent his entire life telling him to fake it until he made it. He cried that they taught him appearance was the only thing that mattered in this world. They convinced him that if he just looked wealthy and moved in the right elite social circles, the real money would eventually follow. He said when Courtney introduced him to her father, he saw a golden opportunity to prove our parents right. He was given a low-level executive job at the commercial construction firm, but he managed to gain unauthorized access to the primary corporate accounts. He started siphoning small amounts at first, just to pay for fancy dinners and expensive jewelry for Courtney. He swore he intended to put the money back as soon as his own personal investments paid off. But his investments were just as fake as his career, and the small thefts quickly spiraled into hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from the company ledger. He sat there on my couch, a grown man crying like a toddler, waiting for me to comfort him or magically offer a solution. He begged me to help him cover up his crimes. He pleaded with me to use my vast venture capital funds to quietly replace the stolen money before Courtney or the corporate accountants noticed it was missing. He promised he would completely change his life and never steal another dime if I just bailed him out this one last time. I felt absolutely nothing for him but a profound sense of pity. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my non-negotiable terms. I told him he had exactly 24 hours to make things right. He was going to pack his pathetic belongings, walk out of my building, and go directly to the estate of his father-in-law. He was going to sit down with the man he robbed and confess to every single stolen dollar. Andre looked at me in pure, unadulterated horror. He shook his head violently, begging me to reconsider. He cried that his father-in-law was a ruthless, powerful businessman who would absolutely destroy him. He whimpered that Courtney would immediately finalize the annulment and never speak to him again, and that he would end up rotting in a federal prison. He crawled off the couch and literally begged on his knees, grabbing the silk hem of my robe. I stepped back, pulling my robe out of his desperate grasp. I told him his future and his freedom were no longer my concern. I informed him that if he did not make a full formal confession by this time tomorrow, I would personally forward the screenshots of the transfer notifications and the offshore routing numbers directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him I would gladly watch him be dragged out of my luxury lobby in handcuffs if he tried to hide in my home. He realized I was absolutely serious. There was no warmth or sibling loyalty left in my eyes. He slowly got up from the floor, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. He gathered his coat and his tablet, walking out of my front door into the dark hallway without saying another word. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet dark. The next morning, the bright sunlight streamed through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I had just finished my morning workout and was preparing a fresh green smoothie when the secure intercom on my wall buzzed. It was my lobby doorman. He sounded incredibly apologetic as he informed me that a professional process server was downstairs, insisting on delivering a legal document directly to my hands. I told the doorman to send the man up. I tightened the belt of my robe and waited patiently by the door. A few minutes later, a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit knocked on my door. He handed me a thick manila envelope, asked me to confirm my identity, and quickly walked away toward the elevator. I carried the heavy envelope over to my marble kitchen island and tore it open. I pulled out a stack of dense legal paperwork bearing the official seal of the state court. I scanned the bold text on the cover page. It was a formal legal subpoena. Vanessa and her sleazy attorney were not just threatening me on morning television anymore. They had legally summoned me to testify under oath in her massive wrongful termination lawsuit against Julian Pierce. I read through the attached demands and allegations. They were attempting to put me on the witness stand in front of a judge and a jury. Their legal strategy was incredibly transparent and desperate. They believed they had me completely cornered. They thought that by forcing me to testify under penalty of perjury, I would crack under the immense public pressure and publicly admit to the fake scandalous affair with Julian just to save myself from legal trouble. They genuinely believed their coordinated smear campaign and this aggressive legal maneuver would break my spirit and guarantee Vanessa her multi-million-dollar settlement. I set the documents down on the cool marble counter next to my smoothie. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I realized the magnitude of their mistake. They thought they were dragging me into an inescapable trap, but they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. My foolish family had just handed me the perfect public stage to destroy them completely, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The morning sun reflected off the polished mahogany table in the center of the high-rise boardroom. I sat at the head of the table looking across at Julian Pierce. Julian looked impeccably calm for a chief executive officer facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. He was reviewing a stack of documents while my lead attorney paced the length of the room. The attorney was outlining our defense strategy, explaining how easily we could file a motion to quash the subpoena. He argued that Vanessa had absolutely no hard evidence to support her ridiculous claim of a scandalous affair, and that my testimony was completely irrelevant to her wrongful termination. I took a sip of water and set my glass down on the coaster. I looked at the attorney and told him we were not going to quash the subpoena. I told him I wanted to testify. Julian raised his head from the documents and met my eyes. He smiled slightly, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. He asked me what exactly I was planning. I laid out the strategy for the entire room. I explained that my mother and father were putting immense pressure on me to sign a false affidavit. They wanted me to admit to the affair so Vanessa could secure a massive settlement out of court. They expected Julian to settle to avoid a public relations nightmare. But settling would only give Vanessa exactly what she wanted and allow her to walk away unpunished. I told the legal team that we were going to let Vanessa take the stand first. We were going to let her sit under oath in a recorded deposition and present her fabricated narrative to the legal record. We would let her commit documented perjury. The lead attorney stopped pacing. He warned me that letting her testify meant we would have to go on the offensive and that the media would inevitably get hold of the story. He said it could cause a temporary dip in corporate stock. Julian waved his hand, dismissing the concern. He stated that his board of directors was fully aware of the situation and they trusted my judgment completely. Julian looked at me and agreed to the plan. He said we would let Vanessa dig her own grave and then we would hand the shovel over to the federal prosecutor. Once Vanessa lied under oath and submitted fraudulent documents as evidence, she would be locked into a federal crime. There would be no walking back and no out-of-court settlement to save her. We finalized the details of the trap, and I left the boardroom feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I took the private elevator down to the executive suite of my own venture capital firm. The glass doors slid open, and I stepped into the quiet reception area. My assistant was usually at her desk, but the space was empty. Before I could even wonder where she was, the heavy glass doors to my personal office flew open. Courtney marched out, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She was wearing a dark, oversized coat and oversized sunglasses, looking frantic and completely unhinged. She had somehow bypassed the lobby security, presumably by slipping into the elevator behind one of my executives and using her wealthy entitlement to intimidate her way past the front desk. I did not raise my voice or show any surprise. I simply walked past her into my office and sat down behind my desk. Courtney followed me inside, slamming the door shut behind her. She ripped off her sunglasses and glared at me with absolute venom. She demanded that I write a check to cover the debts of my pathetic brother immediately. She paced back and forth in front of my desk, waving her manicured hands in the air. She explained that the catering company and the luxury wedding planners were threatening to file a massive lawsuit against her father for the unpaid wedding bills. She said her father was a prominent real estate developer, and his reputation could not withstand the public humiliation of a scandal involving a broke, fraudulent son-in-law. Courtney leaned over my desk, planting her hands flat on the polished surface. She hissed that I was going to wire the money to her family by the end of the day. She needed to quietly pay off the vendors and secure an immediate annulment to erase Andre from her life completely. She said if I refused to bail out my brother, she would go directly to the press. She threatened to call every major news outlet and local journalist in the city. She claimed she would tell them that my venture capital firm was nothing but a fake shell company used to launder money, and that my entire tech empire was an elaborate illusion. She smiled a cruel, entitled smile, believing she had just cornered me with the ultimate blackmail. I sat perfectly still, letting her finish her ridiculous tantrum. I did not feel threatened or intimidated by her childish demands. I calmly opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a sleek manila folder. I had printed the documents earlier that morning after Andre left my condo. I placed the folder gently on the center of my desk and pushed it toward her. I told Courtney that before she called the press, she might want to look at what her new husband had been doing during his brief employment at her father's construction firm. Courtney looked at the folder with suspicion. She scoffed, telling me she did not care about my fake corporate documents. I simply nodded toward the folder and told her to open it. I explained that the pages inside contained date-stamped screenshots of offshore banking transfers, routing numbers, and corporate account ledgers. I kept my voice entirely conversational as I told her that Andre had not just lied about his personal wealth. I informed her that my brother had been actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the corporate accounts of her father to fund the luxury lifestyle she demanded. Courtney snatched the folder off the desk and ripped it open. Her eyes darted rapidly across the printed pages. I watched as the arrogant entitlement completely vanished from her features. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin an unhealthy shade of pale. Her hands began to shake violently, causing the papers to rustle in the quiet office. She stared at the offshore routing numbers and the exact sums of money stolen from her own family business. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing, without making a single sound, as the devastating reality of her situation finally took hold. Courtney stared at the documents, her perfectly manicured hands trembling so violently that the papers rattled in the quiet office. The arrogant entitlement completely vanished from her features, replaced by a horrified realization. She tried to speak, but her mouth only opened and closed, without making a single sound. I sat comfortably in my chair, watching her process the undeniable proof that the man she married was actively stealing from her own family. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and utter fury. She did not scream or throw another tantrum. The reality of the embezzlement was too severe for her usual theatrics. She practically shoved the papers back into the folder, gripping it tightly against her chest as if it were a weapon. She turned on her heel and stormed out of my office, moving with a terrifying, singular purpose. She bypassed my assistant and the elevator bank, taking the heavy emergency exit stairs in her designer heels, desperate to find the man who had just destroyed her father's company ledger. Courtney drove straight to the affluent suburban neighborhood where my parents lived. Andre had retreated there after I kicked him out of my condo, seeking the blind comfort and protection of Calvin and Renee. Courtney did not bother to knock. She bypassed the sprawling front lawn and threw open the heavy oak front door, marching directly into the formal living room where my family was gathered. Andre was sitting on the plush sofa looking miserable while my mother rubbed his shoulders. Calvin was pacing the floor, likely strategizing how to spin the current public relations disaster. They all froze as Courtney stormed into the room. She threw the manila folder directly at Andre's chest. The papers scattered across the expensive Persian rug. She screamed that he was a thief, a parasite, and a pathetic con artist. Andre scrambled backward, his face turning an ashen gray as he recognized the banking documents. Renee immediately jumped up, positioning herself protectively in front of her golden child. She raised her voice, pointing a finger at Courtney, and demanding that she stop speaking to her husband that way. Calvin stepped forward, puffing out his chest, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate his wealthy white daughter-in-law. He loudly insisted that his son was a respectable businessman from a proud African-American family and that any missing money was simply a corporate misunderstanding. Courtney let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She looked at Calvin with pure disgust and told him to stop playing the victim. She screamed that there was no misunderstanding, only a calculated malicious theft, orchestrated by a family of absolute frauds. She pointed out that they had spent the entire wedding planning process acting like old money elites looking down on everyone else, while their precious son was secretly siphoning $250,000 from her father to pay for his fake billionaire aesthetic. The blowout was massive and deafening. Renee shouted that Courtney's family was elitist and controlling, accusing her of driving Andre to desperate measures just to keep up with her ridiculous materialistic demands. Calvin yelled that the construction firm owed Andre that money for his brilliant executive contributions. Courtney did not back down for a single second. She stepped right up to my father and told him his delusions were exactly why his son was a criminal. She turned her burning gaze back to Andre, who was still cowering on the sofa, too terrified to speak. She informed him with ice-cold precision that she had already spoken to her father and their team of corporate lawyers on the drive over. She announced that she was filing for an immediate annulment based on fraud, completely erasing their marriage from the public record. Andre let out a pathetic whimper, begging her to let him explain, pleading that he only stole the money because he loved her so much and wanted to give her the world. Courtney sneered at him, completely unmoved by his tears. She delivered the final crushing blow. She told him her father was not just firing him, he was turning the complete dossier of the offshore transfers directly over to the police before the end of the business day. She promised Andre that she would personally ensure he spent the next 10 years in a federal prison cell for corporate embezzlement. Without another word, Courtney turned around and walked out of the house, slamming the front door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames. The silence left in the wake of her departure was thick and suffocating. Andre curled into a ball on the sofa, sobbing hysterically about losing his freedom and his perfect life. Renee hovered over him, crying and telling him everything was going to be completely fine, even though she had absolutely no idea how to fix it. Calvin stared at the closed door, his chest heaving with deep, angry breaths. He absolutely refused to accept defeat. His pride and his relentless need to maintain the family image overrode all logic and reality. He pulled out his phone and immediately dialed my number. I was sitting at my desk back at the venture capital firm when his name flashed on my private line. I let it go straight to voicemail, but the transcription instantly popped up on my screen. I read his frantic, commanding words as he paced his living room. He demanded that I stop playing selfish games and step up for my family. He ordered me to immediately liquidate my measly condo and empty my savings accounts to pay off Courtney's father. He insisted that if I just wrote a check to cover the missing $250,000, the criminal charges would vanish and Andre's reputation would be completely saved. He told me it was my fundamental duty as a sister to sacrifice my own assets to keep my brother out of a prison cell. I did not even blink at his staggering audacity. I simply deleted the voicemail and tossed my phone onto the desk. I was entirely done dealing with their endless, parasitic demands. However, the sheer scale of Andre's corporate theft and my family's complete lack of financial boundaries had triggered a deep, unsettling suspicion in the back of my mind. If my brother was willing to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from his powerful father-in-law, there was no telling what else they had done to secure funding for their lavish, fake lifestyle over the years. I opened my secure laptop and logged directly into the primary credit reporting bureaus. I decided to run a comprehensive deep dive background and credit check on my own personal identification details, just to ensure they had not tried to attach my name to any of their recent disasters. The loading icon spun for a few seconds before the master report populated on my screen. I scrolled past my pristine credit card history and my legitimate mortgage payments. Then my eyes locked onto a massive, glaring anomaly listed under active corporate liabilities. My breath completely hitched in my throat. There, sitting active and open on my personal credit profile, was a staggering $500,000 commercial loan. The loan had been taken out over a year ago, directly tied to my social security number, and I had absolutely never signed for it. I stared at the glowing numbers on my monitor, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. $500,000. The massive commercial loan was flagged as an open active liability tied directly to my social security number. The origination date was marked exactly 4 years ago. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, but my mind instantly shifted into an icy, hyper-focused state. I did not panic. I simply reached across my desk and picked up my phone. I bypassed my regular corporate legal team and called my private forensic accountant directly. David answered on the second ring. I did not bother with any polite pleasantries. I gave him the loan origination number, the specific bank details, and my personal identification information. I ordered him to drop everything he was currently working on and track every single cent of that $500,000 disbursement. I needed to know exactly which account received those funds, who signed the authorizing documents, and where the money was currently located. While David worked his magic, I paced the length of my quiet office. The fragmented pieces of my past were violently shifting into place, answering questions that had haunted me for years. 4 years ago, I had just separated myself from my toxic family and was desperately trying to launch my first software company. I vividly remembered the humiliating sting of sitting in a sterile bank office applying for a modest business loan to get my tech startup off the ground. I remembered the loan officer looking at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion as he slid my application back across the desk. He had told me my credit profile was severely compromised, showing massive, unverified liabilities that made me a high-risk client. I had spent months frantically fighting the credit bureaus, but I was a broke 20-something with absolutely no resources to hire proper legal representation to unravel the tangled mess. That invisible financial weight had forced me into the shadows. Because traditional banking institutions absolutely refused to touch me, I had to build my entire tech empire completely off the grid. I was forced to operate exclusively in cash. I had to use complex proxy holding companies and rely on silent overseas investors to launch my platforms and mask my identity. My family had spent the last 4 years mocking my lack of visible assets. They constantly called me a struggling failure who lived in the dark while they flaunted their supposed wealth in the sunlight. They paraded their luxury goods in my face and told me I was a disappointment because I had nothing to show for my life. Now I was looking at the exact reason I was forced to live in the dark. An hour later, my computer pinged with a secure encrypted email from David. I opened the attached dossier, and a cold, heavy realization settled into my stomach. The $500,000 commercial loan had not been paid out to a legitimate business venture. The funds were wired directly into a newly formed limited liability company registered under the name Apex Elite Holdings. David had pulled the official corporate registry documents for the shell company. The sole proprietor and registered agent was my perfect golden child sister, Vanessa. I read through the detailed expenditure reports David had managed to trace from the fraudulent shell account. The stolen money had not been invested in real estate or legitimate business assets. It had been systematically drained month after month to fund Vanessa and her entire fake existence. There were massive recurring payments for her luxury imported vehicles. There were heavy wire transfers sent to high-end real estate brokers to cover the lease on her downtown penthouse. There were hundreds of thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques, exclusive plastic surgery clinics, and elite country club initiation fees. Vanessa had essentially stolen my financial identity, forged my signature on federal bank documents, and ruined my credit for years just to finance her fake executive lifestyle. She had built her entire throne of superiority using my stolen name and my ruined future. The sheer magnitude of her betrayal was staggering. She had sat at countless family dinners looking down her nose at me, criticizing my modest clothes and my quiet life, while she was literally wearing shoes bought with my stolen credit. I reached for my desk phone, fully intending to call the federal authorities and have her arrested for grand larceny and identity theft right this second. My finger hovered over the dial pad, then I slowly pulled my hand back. A dark, calculated smile spread across my face as a much better plan formed in my mind. Calling the police right now would be a massive waste of leverage. If I had her arrested today, she would immediately hire an expensive criminal defense attorney, claim she was framed, and drag the investigation out for years. She would refuse to answer questions and hide behind her legal counsel. She might even try to blame the forgery on someone else. But tomorrow was the official deposition for her wrongful termination lawsuit against Julian Pierce. She had legally subpoenaed me to testify. She was planning to sit in a room full of corporate lawyers and a court reporter and lie under oath about my relationship with Julian to extort millions of dollars from his company. If I exposed the identity theft now, she would never take the stand. The deposition would be canceled and she would go into hiding. But if I kept my mouth shut and walked into that deposition room tomorrow, I could let her completely destroy herself. I would sit back and let her confidently commit documented perjury on the legal record. I would let her build her web of lies under oath. Then I would hand the explosive financial dossier directly to the lawyers and the judge. I would not just be exposing a liar, I would be trapping her in a federal crime with absolutely no route for escape. I closed the financial dossier on my laptop and carefully transferred all the downloaded documents onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I slipped the small drive into the hidden pocket of my designer leather briefcase, ensuring my ultimate weapon was perfectly prepared for the morning. My office was quiet as the evening shadows stretched across the floor. The silence was suddenly broken by the sharp chime of my cell phone resting on the edge of my desk. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Vanessa. The message was brief, dripping with her usual arrogant delusion. She wrote, "See you in court tomorrow, loser, get ready to lose everything." I stared at the glowing words and let out a soft, cold laugh. She had absolutely no idea that she was the one walking blindly into a slaughter. I did not text her back. I simply turned off my phone, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out of my office fully prepared to watch my sister burn her own life to the ground. I walked into the downtown law firm the next morning wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a completely blank expression. The receptionist directed me to conference room B. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the sterile, freezing environment. The room smelled of expensive coffee and aggressive entitlement. Vanessa was already seated at the long mahogany table. She was wearing a perfectly pressed designer dress, projecting the exact image of a tragic, wrongly terminated corporate executive. Sitting directly beside her was her attorney, a slick, greasy man named Marcus, who looked like he specialized in high-stakes corporate extortion. But the real surprise was sitting in the gallery chairs placed against the back wall. Calvin and Renee had actually shown up. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, projecting a unified front of moral support for their golden child. My mother glared at me with absolute contempt as I took my seat across from them. My father crossed his arms, leaning back with a smug, satisfied grin. They genuinely believed they were here to watch my final public humiliation. The court reporter swore me and her fingers hovering expertly over the stenography machine. Marcus did not waste a single second. He leaned across the table, locking his eyes onto mine, and launched into a brutal, aggressive line of questioning. He did not ask about my professional qualifications or my business portfolio. He immediately attacked my character. He demanded to know the exact nature of my relationship with Julian Pierce. He phrased every single question as a calculated insult. He painted a picture for the legal record of a bitter, jealous sister who was failing at life and desperate for a handout. He asked if it was true that I harbored a deep-seated resentment toward Vanessa because of her undeniable corporate success and flawless reputation. I looked directly at the court reporter and answered with a calm, simple yes. I confirmed that there was tension between us. Marcus smiled like a predator who had just drawn blood. He paced slightly around his leather chair, elevating his voice so my parents could hear every word of his theatrical performance. He accused me of targeting Julian Pierce because of his immense wealth and immense industry influence. He stated that I had manipulated my way into his private social circle, using my physical appearance to secure his undivided favor. He outright accused me of orchestrating a scandalous, inappropriate relationship with the chief executive officer solely to turn him against his top-performing vice president. He practically shouted that I had fed Julian a web of vicious lies about Vanessa, convincing him to terminate her lucrative contract out of sheer petty spite. He wanted it firmly on the record that I was a gold digger who had slept her way to the top just to tear my own flesh and blood down. I did not raise my voice. I did not get defensive. I did not throw the water glass sitting in front of me. I simply folded my hands on the smooth surface of the table and answered his leading questions with short, precise responses. I let him monologue. I let him build his elaborate fictional narrative out loud, ensuring every single word was permanently transcribed into the official court record. He submitted fabricated emails into evidence claiming they were anonymous tips proving my illicit behavior. He submitted doctored witness statements from former employees who supposedly saw me sneaking into Julian's private office late at night. I glanced at Vanessa. She was practically vibrating with joy. She was biting her lower lip to hide a massive, triumphant smile. My parents were nodding enthusiastically in the background, completely blinded by their own delusion. They thought my calm demeanor was a sign of total defeat. They thought I was shutting down under the immense legal pressure. They had no idea I was patiently watching them lock themselves into federal perjury. As Marcus droned on, my mind drifted back to the discovery I had made the night before, the staggering $500,000 commercial loan sitting on my credit report. Vanessa was not just greedy, she was absolutely desperate. She had stolen my identity and forged my signature to fund her fake executive lifestyle. She needed this multi-million-dollar settlement from Julian, not just for revenge, but to quietly pay off the massive fraudulent debt before the bank auditors caught up with her. She was trying to extort Julian to save herself from a federal prison sentence. And here she was cementing her own doom by lying under penalty of perjury. Marcus slammed another document onto the table, sliding it aggressively toward me. He demanded that I read the highlighted section aloud. It was a fabricated internal memo, suggesting Julian was planning to give me a highly paid consultancy role as a reward for getting rid of Vanessa. I read the words perfectly clearly, making sure the court reporter captured every single syllable. Marcus leaned over the table, getting uncomfortably close to my face. He asked if I was ready to admit that the entire termination was a coordinated malicious attack born out of my own pathetic jealousy. He told me that if I confessed right now, they would show me mercy in the civil settlement and keep my name out of the media. I looked past him and made direct eye contact with Vanessa. I told him I had nothing to confess because everything they had presented so far spoke entirely for itself. The trap was fully set. The lies were sworn and notarized. The fraudulent documents were officially entered into the permanent legal record. There was absolutely no way for Vanessa to back out now. She had just handed the federal prosecutor a perfectly wrapped gift, and she was entirely too arrogant to realize it. Marcus sneered clearly, believing he had won the psychological war. He opened his mouth to deliver his final closing demand. Before he could speak a single word, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. The sudden noise echoed sharply in the tense, quiet room, causing everyone to turn their heads. Julian Pierce walked into the room. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, radiating an aura of absolute untouchable power. Vanessa immediately sat up straighter, adjusting her posture, and putting on her best victim face, assuming he was here to negotiate a desperate settlement. Marcus smiled, preparing to welcome the opposing party. But Julian did not walk toward the defense side of the table. He did not look at Vanessa or acknowledge my parents. He walked with slow, deliberate steps directly over to my side of the room. He stopped right behind my chair, placing his hands firmly on the back of it. He stood tall, casting a long, intimidating shadow over the table, presenting a silent, unbreakable wall of solidarity. Julian, standing behind my chair, sent a massive shockwave through the sterile, high-end legal conference room. Marcus stopped speaking right in the middle of his aggressive, insulting sentence. His mouth hung slightly open as he stared at the powerful chief executive officer who had just interrupted his perfect theatrical performance. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her plush leather seat, her arrogant, confident smile completely vanishing from her face. She exchanged a quick, panicked look with our parents sitting against the back wall. Calvin puffed out his chest, trying to project his usual dominant authority, but his eyes betrayed his deep, sudden fear. Renee gripped her expensive designer handbag tightly against her lap, staring at Julian like he was an absolute ghost haunting the room. The court reporter kept typing, her fingers moving rapidly over the keys, capturing the suffocating, deafening silence that had fallen over the long mahogany table. Marcus finally recovered his professional composure, adjusting his expensive silk tie and clearing his throat loudly. He addressed Julian directly, asking him to state his name for the official deposition record. Marcus spoke with a mocking, arrogant tone, clearly assuming Julian was simply there to blindly defend his secret mistress and offer a massive financial settlement to make the scandalous lawsuit quietly disappear. Julian did not look at Marcus. He did not look at my parents or my trembling sister. He looked down at me with deep, professional respect and unwavering loyalty. He placed his hands flat on the polished table and spoke with a calm, powerful authority that demanded absolute attention from every single person in the room. He formally stated his name for the court reporter, ensuring his presence was noted on the official record. Then he smoothly informed the entire legal assembly that he was not present to negotiate any kind of financial settlement with a former disgraced employee. He stated he was simply there in his official corporate capacity to support his direct superior. Marcus frowned, his forehead wrinkling in total confused disbelief. He arrogantly reminded Julian that he was the chief executive officer of the company and therefore had no superiors in the corporate hierarchy. Julian let out a short, dark, humorless laugh that echoed off the cold walls. He looked directly at Vanessa and delivered the exact words that would completely destroy her entire fabricated reality. He formally introduced me to the room, not as his romantic partner or his pathetic secret mistress. He introduced me as Sasha, the sole founder and primary majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. He clarified for the official legal record that Apex Holdings was the master parent corporation that wholly owned and entirely operated the marketing firm where Vanessa used to work. The heavy gold pen slipped right out of Marcus' hand. It hit the wooden table with a loud, sharp clatter and rolled slowly onto the carpeted floor. Marcus did not even try to bend down and pick it up. He just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing he had just spent an hour legally insulting a billionaire corporate titan. Vanessa looked like all the blood had been violently drained from her entire body. Her skin turned a sickly pale gray, and her jaw practically dropped to the table in absolute horror. She stared at me, shaking her head in silent, frantic denial, refusing to accept the nightmare unfolding before her. Calvin and Renee were completely frozen in their gallery chairs. The arrogant entitlement they had proudly carried into the room shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. The crushing reality of the situation washed over them like a freezing tidal wave. I was not a struggling failure who needed their pity. I was not a jealous, bitter sister begging for scraps of attention in the dark shadows. I was the silent billionaire boss. I was the ultimate executive authority who had been signing Vanessa's massive corporate paychecks for the past 3 years. I literally owned the ground she walked on and the desk she sat behind. I had built a massive global tech and marketing empire while they spent their precious time laughing at my cheap clothes and my quiet, invisible life. Before anyone on the opposing side could remember how to breathe, my lead, corporate counsel stepped confidently into the room. Eleanor was a terrifyingly sharp attorney who specialized in corporate espionage and high-stakes litigation. She walked right past Julian and placed a massive, thick stack of heavily redacted files directly onto the center of the table. She addressed Marcus with a tone of pure, absolute legal ice. She informed him that his entire wrongful termination lawsuit was a complete frivolous farce designed to extort my company. She stated that her client was officially moving to have the case thrown out immediately, with extreme prejudice. Marcus stammered nervously, trying to argue that his client was a top-performing vice president who was maliciously fired due to personal family jealousy and petty spite. Eleanor did not even blink at his pathetic defense. She opened the top folder and began reading the actual documented reasons for Vanessa's immediate termination. She read the severe charges out loud, ensuring the court reporter captured every single damning syllable. Vanessa was not fired because of any sibling rivalry or inappropriate workplace romance. She was terminated with extreme prejudice for gross executive incompetence, deliberate financial mismanagement, and severe corporate espionage. Eleanor methodically detailed exactly how my internal security team had caught Vanessa actively leaking highly confidential client data to our biggest industry rivals. She had been secretly selling our proprietary marketing algorithms and private corporate strategies in exchange for massive illegal under-the-table kickbacks. She used those hidden payments to help fund her lavish lifestyle and maintain her fake wealthy aesthetic to impress our parents. Eleanor presented the undeniable digital footprints, the tracked encrypted emails, and the verified offshore wire transfers, linking Vanessa directly to the ongoing corporate sabotage. She completely dismantled the false narrative Marcus had spent the last hour aggressively building. The wrongful termination lawsuit was nothing but a desperate, panicked extortion attempt by a corrupt employee trying to squeeze millions of dollars out of the company she had just betrayed. Marcus looked physically ill, staring at the undeniable proof of his client's guilt. He slowly pushed his leather chair away from Vanessa, as if her sudden legal toxicity was highly contagious. He realized he had been completely manipulated into bringing a fraudulent lawsuit against a powerful billionaire corporate owner, and his own prestigious legal career was now in severe jeopardy. Calvin tried to speak from the back of the room. He opened his mouth to defend his precious golden child, to demand respect and order like he always did at our miserable family dinners. But he had absolutely no power in this sterile room. He was sitting in my corporate kingdom, and he finally realized he was nothing but a helpless spectator watching his legacy burn. Renee started crying silent, terrified tears, gripping Calvin's arm tightly as she watched her perfect daughter's life completely unravel on the official legal record. Vanessa could not handle the crushing, suffocating humiliation of her public exposure. The grand, flawless illusion she had spent years building was entirely dead. She was exposed as a corporate thief and a pathetic, desperate liar in front of her worshipping parents and her high-priced lawyer. She stood up violently, knocking her heavy leather chair backward. It crashed hard against the wall, but she did not care. She screamed that this was all a setup, a malicious, calculated trap designed to ruin her spotless reputation. She yelled that she was leaving and marching straight to the press to expose my corrupt company to the entire world. She turned to storm out of the conference room, desperate to escape the reality of her total defeat. I sat perfectly still, watching her panic and flail. I reached down into my designer briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder containing the financial dossier my forensic accountant had compiled the night before. I slid the heavy folder across the smooth mahogany table. It glided perfectly, stopping right at the edge where Vanessa was standing. I told her she was completely free to walk out that door and drop her frivolous lawsuit right now. But she might want to look at the printed federal banking documents inside that folder first. I watched her angry eyes dart down to the papers as I calmly announced that we needed to discuss the $500,000 commercial loan currently tied to my stolen identity. Vanessa stared at the open folder, her hands trembling so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled against the mahogany table. She read the bold print of the federal bank loan and the origination signatures she had forged 4 years ago. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her a sickly, chalky white. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped her throat. Eleanor stood up tall and explained with absolute terrifying precision exactly what those documents represented. She listed the federal statutes for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. She clearly stated that the penalty for this level of premeditated corporate fraud carried a mandatory sentence of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Marcus immediately stood up and aggressively shoved his leather chair away from the table. He threw his hands in the air and loudly declared that he had absolutely no knowledge of these forged documents or the illegal shell company. He stated he was officially withdrawing as her legal counsel effective immediately because he refused to be an accessory to a massive federal crime. He practically ran out of the room, desperate to save his own prestigious legal career and avoid being implicated in her toxic mess. Vanessa was left entirely alone. She collapsed back into her chair, hyperventilating as the suffocating reality of a concrete prison cell crashed down on her. Julian remained standing silently behind my chair, projecting a wall of quiet, unyielding power as the woman who had tormented me finally faced her own destruction. Vanessa whipped her head around and looked at our parents with wide, terrified eyes. She reached her hands out toward Calvin and Renee, begging them to do something to fix this absolute disaster. She sobbed hysterically, pleading with our father to write a check to use his influence to somehow make this all go away like he always did when she made a mistake. But Calvin and Renee did not move to comfort their precious golden child. Their eyes were locked completely on me. They had just watched my lawyer present undeniable proof of my immense corporate wealth and absolute authority. They had just realized that the daughter they had spent decades abusing, abandoning, and calling a pathetic failure was actually a billionaire executive holding all the power in the entire room. The transition was so immediate and so sickeningly transparent, it actually made my stomach turn. Calvin puffed out his chest and looked at Vanessa with pure, unadulterated disgust. He loudly declared that she was an absolute disgrace to the proud family name and that he would never spend a single dime defending a common criminal. Renee gasped dramatically, pressing her hands to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck by the betrayal. She rushed around the long conference table, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She lunged toward me with her arms wide open, tears streaming down her face, putting on the performance of a lifetime. She cried out, asking how Vanessa could ever do something so evil and malicious to her own flesh and blood. She tried to wrap her arms around my shoulders, whimpering about how she always knew I was destined for greatness, and how proud she was of my incredible business empire. I took a sharp step backward, holding my hand up in a rigid stop gesture that froze her right in her tracks. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and felt absolutely nothing but cold, empty pity. I told her not to touch me and not to pretend she cared about my well-being or my success. I reminded them both that just an hour ago they were sitting in those gallery chairs, smiling and nodding eagerly, while a sleazy lawyer tried to destroy my character and ruin my life. They had enthusiastically supported Vanessa when they thought she was the untouchable winner, and the moment she lost her power, they threw her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. I looked at Calvin and told him his conditional toxic love was exactly why his family was currently falling apart. I explained that I had spent my entire life starving for their approval and working myself to the bone to earn a single scrap of their affection, only to be treated like an embarrassing burden. I finally realized that their love was nothing but a cheap transaction based entirely on status and money, and I was officially refusing to play their sick game anymore. I told them they were parasites who only cared about what I could offer them now that I had unlimited resources. I turned my back on their stunned, hypocritical faces and looked directly at the court reporter. I instructed Eleanor to officially submit the entire financial dossier detailing the identity theft and the shell company expenditures into the formal deposition record. The court reporter nodded and officially marked the documents, entering them into evidence. The trap had permanently snapped shut. Vanessa let out a blood-curdling scream, realizing there was no legal way to undo the evidence that was now officially in the hands of the federal court system. She would be facing the district attorney before the week was over. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire fake wealthy world completely collapsed around her. My parents stood frozen in the middle of the room, entirely stripped of their arrogant pride, and finally facing the devastating consequences of their own toxic parenting. They had worshipped money and status above their own children, and now they were watching their legacy burn to ash. The heavy, tense silence of the ruined room was suddenly shattered by a violent crash. The thick glass door of the conference room was violently thrown open, hitting the adjacent wall with a terrifying, deafening bang. Everyone jumped in shock as the heavy glass rattled in its frame. Andre burst into the room panting heavily and sweating profusely. His expensive, tailored suit was completely ripped at the shoulder, and his tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He looked like a wild, cornered animal who had been running for his life. He stared at our parents with wild, panicked eyes and screamed that Courtney was not bluffing about turning the banking documents over. He choked on his own words, crying hysterically as he announced that his powerful father-in-law had officially filed the corporate embezzlement charges without any hesitation. He backed against the glass wall, terrified and completely broken, gripping his hair with trembling hands. He sobbed that he had tried to run, but the building security had locked down the elevators. He looked at Calvin and whimpered that the police had followed him inside the building and were already downstairs in the main lobby, waiting to place him in handcuffs. Andre was still pressing his back against the cold glass wall, taking shallow, panicked breaths, when the heavy conference room doors swung open for the third time. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the room, followed closely by a plainclothes federal detective holding a thick stack of manila folders. The aggressive energy in the room instantly evaporated, leaving behind a suffocating, terrified silence. The detective stepped forward and calmly announced that he had active federal arrest warrants for both Andre and Vanessa. Andre did not even try to run or deny the charges. His legs completely gave out beneath him, and he slid down the glass wall until he hit the carpeted floor. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly like a terrified child. One of the uniformed officers walked over to him and roughly pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet room. Calvin watched his only son being restrained and treated like a dangerous criminal, but he was completely paralyzed by shock. Vanessa tried to shrink down into her plush leather executive chair, desperately hoping the officers would somehow overlook her presence. She tried to arrange her features into a mask of confused innocence, but her entire body was shaking uncontrollably. The federal detective walked directly toward her side of the massive mahogany table. He looked down at her and coldly instructed her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. Vanessa immediately started shaking her head side to side in frantic denial. She stammered that there was a massive misunderstanding and that she was a highly respected corporate vice president who was currently in the middle of an important legal deposition. She pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled that I was the one they needed to investigate because I was running a corrupt, illegal operation. The detective did not even blink at her pathetic theatrical display. He simply read aloud the official federal charges of aggravated identity theft, interstate wire fraud, and commercial bank forgery. Eleanor, my brilliant corporate attorney, calmly picked up the comprehensive financial dossier we had compiled and slid it directly across the table to the detective. The detective took the heavy folder, nodding his head in silent professional acknowledgement. He told Vanessa they already had all the forensic proof they needed to secure a conviction. The second uniformed officer grabbed Vanessa's arm and hauled her out of the leather chair. Vanessa completely lost her mind. She started thrashing and kicking, screaming that she was a wealthy elite who did not belong in handcuffs. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face, and her expensive designer dress became twisted and wrinkled as she fought the officers. It took both officers to finally wrench her arms behind her back and secure the heavy steel cuffs around her delicate wrists. She looked absolutely feral and pathetic, completely stripped of her arrogant, polished corporate facade. She was crying hysterically, begging anyone in the room to make it stop. The sheer visual horror of watching both of their golden children being physically restrained by law enforcement completely broke my parents. The massive wall of arrogant pride and elitist entitlement they had built over decades crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. Calvin and Renee abandoned all their carefully crafted dignity. They stumbled away from the gallery wall and rushed directly toward me. They threw themselves onto the floor, stopping right at my feet. Renee reached out and desperately grabbed my legs, burying her tear-stained face against my knees. She was crying so hard, she could barely form coherent sentences. She begged me to use my massive billionaire resources to pay for their bail. She screamed that I had unlimited money and powerful corporate lawyers, and that I could easily save her precious children from going to a federal prison. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks and reminded me that they were my blood, and that family must always protect each other in times of absolute crisis. Calvin dropped to his knees right beside her, his chest heaving with desperate, panicked breaths. The man who had spent my entire life looking down his nose at me was now literally bowing at my feet. He pleaded with me to write a blank check to fix this absolute disaster. He promised he would do anything I asked if I just made a single phone call to stop the police from taking his children away. I looked down at the two people who had spent 20 years making me feel like a worthless, invisible burden. I felt absolutely no sympathy and no guilt. I felt nothing but a cold, refreshing wave of absolute closure. I slowly and deliberately pulled my legs away from Renee's, grasping hands, taking a deliberate step backward to distance myself from their pathetic display. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I looked directly into my mother's weeping eyes and reminded them of the exact words they had used against me at every single family dinner. I told them I was just a useless, unemployed failure who was living off the family charity. I reminded them that I was a massive disappointment who had absolutely no assets to my name and no future to speak of. I looked Calvin dead in the eye and told him I did not have a single dime to waste on bailing out convicted felons. I stated that my money was reserved for my legitimate corporate empire and not for covering the tracks of pathetic thieves. Julian stepped forward and placed a warm, supportive hand on the small of my back, gently guiding me away from the table. Eleanor gathered our remaining documents and slipped them into her briefcase. We turned around and walked out of the sterile conference room, together without looking back a single time. We left Calvin and Renee sobbing loudly on the floor, while the police officers forcibly dragged Vanessa and Andre out the door toward the freight elevators. The sound of my sister's hysterical screaming echoed down the long hallway until the heavy metal elevator doors finally slid shut, cutting off the noise completely. Later that evening, the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city. Calvin and Renee drove back to their lavish suburban neighborhood completely exhausted and thoroughly traumatized by the day's events. They had spent hours at the police precinct helplessly watching their children being processed and booked into federal holding cells. They drove in complete silence, desperately needing the familiar comfort and safety of their expensive leased estate. They parked their luxury sedan in the wide driveway and slowly walked up the manicured stone pathway, entirely drained of their usual arrogance. They walked up the front steps, intending to hide inside their expensive sanctuary and figure out a way to survive the massive public scandal. But when they reached the heavy oak front door, they immediately froze. A bright yellow legal document was taped securely to the wood right above the brass handle. Calvin reached up with trembling hands and pulled the thick paper down. It was an official notice of immediate eviction. They had no idea that my holding company had recently purchased the private real estate firm that owned their luxurious property. I was officially their landlord, and I had just permanently terminated their lease, effectively rendering them entirely homeless. 30 days passed since that bright yellow eviction notice was firmly taped to their heavy oak front door. The sprawling, majestic suburban estate that Calvin and Renee had proudly ruled like a royal kingdom was now swarming with rough, sweaty movers, hauling their entire lives into the back of massive rented trucks. The blazing afternoon sun beat down on the perfectly manicured lawn, where my parents stood side by side, watching their precious hoarded wealth being unceremoniously shoved into cheap brown cardboard boxes. They watched their expensive imported rugs, their crystal chandeliers, and their custom Italian furniture being carelessly wrapped in thick moving blankets by men who simply did not care about their precious social status. They were officially being forced to downsize from a glorious 10-bedroom mansion into a dark, cramped 2-bedroom apartment located on the absolute outer edge of the city limits. The neighborhood they were moving to was notorious for high crime rates and crumbling infrastructure. Their new reality was a decaying concrete building that smelled faintly of old bleach and stale cigarette smoke. They had spent the last 4 weeks desperately calling every single wealthy friend and elite socialite connection they had ever known, begging for temporary loans or a place to stay. Every single person had immediately sent them straight to voicemail. The toxic radioactive fallout from Vanessa's highly public federal arrest and Andre's massive corporate embezzlement scandal had completely destroyed their flawless social reputation overnight. They were officially untouchable outcasts in the exact elite circles they had spent their entire lives worshipping. I sat quietly in the back of my sleek black town car, watching the pathetic scene unfold through the tinted windows. I told my driver to pull directly into the wide circular driveway and park right behind the main moving truck. I stepped out of the air-conditioned vehicle, feeling the warm summer breeze against my face. I wore a simple, sharp-tailored suit projecting an aura of absolute calm control. Renee spotted me walking up the stone pathway and completely lost whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. She abandoned the box of fine china she was clutching and ran across the grass toward me. Her face was red and blotchy, her expensive hair was tangled, and her designer blouse was stained with sweat. She stopped a few feet away from me and burst into loud, hysterical sobs. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and aggressively accused me of intentionally destroying our magnificent family legacy. She cried that I was a cruel, vindictive monster who had maliciously orchestrated the complete downfall of her perfect children and single-handedly burned their beautiful life to the ground out of pure spite. She screamed that the family name was permanently ruined and that they were going to die poor and humiliated all because of my vicious, selfish actions. I stood perfectly still, letting her chaotic, emotional outburst wash over me like a harmless breeze. I did not raise my voice or break my steady, unyielding eye contact. I looked at the pathetic, weeping woman in front of me and calmly corrected her deeply flawed narrative. I told her I did not destroy the family legacy because there was absolutely no genuine legacy to destroy. I stated that their entire lives were built on a fragile, rotten foundation of extreme greed, blatant favoritism, and endless toxic lies. They had worshipped Vanessa and Andre, handing them unlimited power and zero accountability, actively creating the exact entitled monsters who eventually committed massive federal felonies. I reminded Renee that they were the ones who sat in a legal conference room, ready to watch me get destroyed just so they could protect Vanessa's fake fraudulent lifestyle. They dug their own financial graves by financing their golden children's illegal schemes and living far beyond their actual means just to impress absolute strangers. The eviction, the arrests, the public humiliation, and the total bankruptcy were simply the natural, unavoidable consequences of their own horrific life choices catching up to them. Renee sobbed harder, shaking her head in frantic denial, refusing to accept any personal accountability for the absolute wreckage surrounding her. Calvin slowly walked over to join his weeping wife, his shoulders slumped and his eyes completely hollow. He looked like an old defeated man stripped of all his blustering authority. I reached a slow, steady hand into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I pulled out a single, crisp $200 bill. I held the green paper between my fingers and extended my arm, offering it directly to my mother. Renee stared at the money with confused, terrified eyes, refusing to take it. I stepped forward and shoved the bill firmly into the front pocket of her wrinkled blouse. I looked directly into her soul and reminded her of a freezing, rainy night exactly 17 years ago. I reminded her of the night she dragged me out of the house on my 18th birthday, holding two crumpled $100 bills. She had shoved that exact amount of cash into my chest, locked the heavy front door in my face, and told me I was a useless burden who needed to figure out how to survive on my own. I repeated her exact words back to her with chilling, perfect clarity. I watched the color completely drain from her face as she finally recognized the absolute poetic justice of the exact sum of money she was holding. I told her to buy some groceries and welcomed her to the real world. The total psychological devastation etched itself permanently into her features as she realized she had spent decades digging the very hole she was currently falling into. The profound, devastating realization of that specific memory hit Renee so hard her knees physically buckled. She let out a choked, agonizing gasp, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of her own historic cruelty echoing back to destroy her. Before Calvin could reach out to catch his collapsing wife, the sudden loud screech of expensive tires violently shattered the heavy tension on the lawn. A sleek silver sports car aggressively whipped into the driveway, cutting off the loading ramp of the moving truck. The driver's side door swung open and Courtney stepped out onto the pavement. Calvin instantly looked up, a desperate, pathetic spark of hope flashing in his tired eyes. He genuinely thought his wealthy, powerful daughter-in-law had arrived at the very last minute to offer them financial sanctuary or write a massive check to save them from their grim apartment. He took a hopeful step forward, preparing to welcome her with open arms. But Courtney did not look at him with any sympathy or familial warmth. She slammed her car door shut and marched right up to Calvin, her face twisted into a vicious, bitter snarl. She did not ask how they were holding up or offer to help them pack. She stopped inches away from his chest and coldly demanded that he immediately take off the solid gold vintage Rolex currently sitting on his wrist. She aggressively informed him that Andre's hidden gambling debts and mounting federal legal fees were rapidly draining her personal bank accounts. She screamed that the federal authorities had frozen all of their joint assets, leaving her entirely responsible for the massive financial wreckage. She stated she was officially confiscating all of his expensive watches and any remaining family heirlooms they had tucked away to pawn them for immediate cash and cover the massive financial nightmare his precious son had left behind. The absolute brutal reality finally settled over the manicured lawn. There was no family loyalty left to salvage. The villains were officially turning on each other like starving, desperate wolves. 3 months later, the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut behind me, echoing loudly through the massive marble hallway. The air inside the imposing building was freezing cold and completely sterile, smelling strongly of harsh floor wax and old legal documents. I walked past the armed security guards and the metal detectors wearing a sharply tailored black suit and quietly took my designated seat in the back row of the public gallery. I was not there to offer any kind of emotional support or hold anyone's trembling hand. I was simply there to watch the final definitive conclusion of a very long and incredibly exhausting business transaction. The courtroom itself was vast and highly intimidating, with high vaulted ceilings and dark, heavy oak paneling that seemed to absorb all the natural light in the room. Calvin and Renee were already seated 2 rows ahead of me on the hard wooden benches. They looked like entirely different people. They were wearing cheap, faded, wrinkled clothes, having completely lost their massive, expensive wardrobe during the sudden eviction and the subsequent federal asset seizures. They sat huddled tightly together, gripping each other's hands and staring blankly ahead at the empty judge's bench. They had spent their entire lives treating their golden children like perfect, untouchable gods, and now they were helplessly waiting for a federal judge to legally lock those gods in concrete cages. The heavy side door opened with a loud creak, and Andre was slowly led into the courtroom by a stern federal marshal. He looked completely pathetic and entirely broken. The arrogant, loud, confident man who used to strut around our miserable family dinners bragging about his expensive sports cars and luxury tropical vacations was entirely gone. He was wearing a drab, oversized beige prison suit that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. He kept his head down, staring at the floor, and refusing to make eye contact with anyone sitting in the gallery. The presiding judge was a strict older woman who had absolutely no patience for wealthy, entitled corporate criminals who arrogantly thought they were above the federal law. She read through the extensive, detailed list of Andre's financial crimes out loud, ensuring every single word was captured on the permanent record. She detailed exactly how he had maliciously embezzled millions of dollars from his own father-in-law to fund his degenerate secret gambling addiction. She looked down at him from her high wooden bench and delivered a scathing, brutal lecture about trust greed and ultimate betrayal. Andre stood there trembling silently, taking short, panicked breaths as she handed down his official punishment. He was given 3 years in a minimum security federal prison facility, followed immediately by 5 years of strict supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay massive financial restitution to the corporate company he had stolen from, ensuring he would be drowning in severe crippling debt for the rest of his natural life. Calvin buried his wrinkled face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic, heaving sob as his only son was handcuffed and quietly led out of the room. There was a brief, agonizing 10-minute recess before the next scheduled case was officially called. I remained perfectly still in my wooden seat, watching the tiny dust motes float peacefully in the bright shafts of sunlight cutting through the high, narrow windows. Then the heavy side door opened again, and Vanessa was escorted into the room. The sight of her was genuinely shocking to witness. My older sister had spent her entire adult life obsessively curating her flawless physical appearance, spending thousands of dollars on expensive glowing skincare, designer silk clothes, and luxury salon treatments. All of that artificial beauty was completely gone. Her hair was dull and lifeless, hanging flat and greasy against her pale, drawn face. She wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit, having been held in federal custody since the exact day of the explosive legal deposition. She looked completely exhausted and incredibly small, standing alone before the towering wooden bench. The judge did not hold back a single ounce of absolute fury when addressing Vanessa. She specifically highlighted the sheer malicious audacity of stealing a family member's identity and forging federal banking documents just to fund a fake luxurious aesthetic. The judge stated clearly that the severe financial crimes were bad enough, but the calculated attempt to commit federal perjury during a sworn corporate deposition showed a complete and utter lack of basic human morality or genuine remorse. Vanessa started crying loudly, begging the judge for basic mercy, claiming she was manipulated and that she just wanted to make her wealthy parents proud. She used her old, familiar, toxic tactics, trying desperately to play the delicate, helpless victim who simply made a tiny, innocent mistake. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down hard, demanding absolute silence in her federal courtroom. She told Vanessa that her crying was nothing but a manipulative theatrical performance and that she was a calculated predator who had eagerly tried to destroy her own sister for personal financial gain. The judge looked directly at Vanessa and officially sentenced her to 5 long, hard years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. Renee let out a horrifying, high-pitched scream, collapsing sideways against Calvin as the crushing, terrifying reality of 5 years behind bars finally settled over the cold courtroom. Vanessa visibly panicked, gasping wildly for air as the federal marshals grabbed her arms to lead her away. As they physically turned her around toward the side exit, Vanessa stopped fighting and looked out into the quiet gallery. Her panicked, desperate eyes scanned the wooden benches until they finally locked directly onto mine. She stared at me with dark, heavy tears streaming down her pale, sunken cheeks. She was searching my face, looking for any tiny trace of sisterly sympathy or shared childhood grief. She clearly expected me to break down crying, to jump up and promise I would hire better corporate lawyers to appeal the harsh judicial decision. She expected the weak, forgotten sister who used to take all her verbal abuse to finally show some soft, pathetic mercy. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch or look away from her desperate, pleading eyes. I sat perfectly straight in my tailored suit, tilted my head slightly, and gave her a polite, cold corporate nod. It was the exact same empty, emotionless gesture I used when concluding a highly successful business merger. Vanessa let out a broken, devastated wail as the marshals forcefully dragged her through the heavy wooden doors and out of my life forever. I stood up, smoothed the tiny wrinkles out of my black skirt, and calmly walked out of the courtroom, leaving my sobbing, broken parents behind without a single backward glance. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight, taking a deep, refreshing breath of clean city air. I started walking down the wide concrete steps, planning to call my private driver and head straight back to my corporate headquarters. Suddenly, a familiar, annoying voice called out my name. I stopped and watched Courtney walking briskly up the stone steps toward me. She was wearing an expensive designer coat and carrying a luxury leather handbag, projecting the perfect image of a flawless, wealthy socialite who had just successfully discarded her trashy criminal husband. She stopped a few steps below me, putting on a bright, incredibly fake, friendly smile. She looked at me like we were old college best friends who were completely united in our shared glorious victory over my terrible, ruined family. She reached out and lightly touched my arm, suggesting we go grab a coffee down the street to celebrate the end of this massive, stressful ordeal. I looked down at her manicured hand resting on my sleeve and felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I realized Courtney actually thought she had won the entire game, and she had absolutely no idea I had one final devastating card left to play. I stared down at Courtney's perfectly manicured hand, resting lightly on the sleeve of my expensive tailored jacket. She was looking at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely dropping the vicious, snarling monster facade she had worn during the eviction. She actually tried to squeeze my arm in a gesture of fake sisterly solidarity. She tilted her head and let out a dramatic sigh, complaining about how exhausting the trial had been, and how we both needed a stiff drink or a strong coffee to celebrate surviving the absolute madness of my toxic family. She rambled on about how she always knew Andre was a lying, manipulative thief, and how she had secretly admired my quiet strength all these years. She was practically vibrating with desperate greed, clearly hoping to pivot her gold-digging claws directly into my massive billionaire fortune, now that her husband was locked in a federal prison. I let her talk for a few more seconds, watching the pathetic, desperate calculations spinning behind her bright, fake eyes. Then I slowly stepped back, letting her hand drop awkwardly to her side. I tilted my head back and let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh that echoed loudly down the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse. I laughed right in her perfectly contoured face, not even trying to hide my absolute contempt for her transparent, pathetic performance. Courtney looked momentarily stunned, her fake friendly smile freezing into a tight, awkward grimace. She asked me what was so funny trying to maintain her polished socialite composure. I stopped laughing and let my expression harden into a mask of pure, cold, corporate ruthlessness. I looked her up and down slowly, taking in her expensive designer coat and her luxury leather handbag that she had undoubtedly purchased using stolen, embezzled money. I told her in a flat, emotionless voice that we were not friends, and we were certainly not going to grab a coffee together. I reminded her of every single family dinner where she had sat across the mahogany table and joined Vanessa in mocking my clothes, my job, and my entire existence. I stated clearly that just because she had turned on Andre at the very last minute to save her own skin did not mean she was suddenly absolved of being a cruel, shallow parasite. Courtney crossed her arms defensively, dropping the friendly act completely. She sneered at me, claiming that she did not need my friendship or my charity because she came from a wealthy, respectable family of her own. She proudly declared that her father owned a massive commercial construction empire, and she was going back to live a life of extreme luxury, far away from the criminal stain of the Wilson family. I watched her puff up with arrogant pride, and I felt a deep, satisfying thrill knowing I was about to completely demolish her last remaining pillar of unearned confidence. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to physically lean back against the heavy stone railing. I kept my voice incredibly soft and lethal. I told her that she clearly had not spoken to her beloved father in the last 48 hours. I explained that when Andre's massive corporate embezzlement scandal hit the national news, it immediately triggered a catastrophic chain reaction of federal audits. I casually informed her that her father's massive commercial construction company had been deeply quietly leveraged with Andre's stolen funds. The moment the federal authorities froze Andre's assets, her father's entire company went into an instant unrecoverable financial tailspin. Courtney stood there completely frozen, her mouth slightly open as the devastating reality of my words slowly began to penetrate her thick skull. I did not stop there. I continued delivering the fatal corporate strike with absolute surgical precision. I told her that when her father's desperate, panicked board of directors realized they were facing immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy, they were forced to organize an emergency fire sale of the entire company to avoid complete public humiliation. I smiled a cold, empty smile and informed her that my massive venture capital firm, Apex Holdings, had swooped in just yesterday morning. We had aggressively purchased all of their outstanding toxic debt and acquired the entire commercial construction empire for pennies on the dollar. The sheer look of absolute naked horror that washed over Courtney's face was something I would remember for the rest of my life. The arrogant, wealthy socialite was suddenly realizing that she had absolutely nothing left. Her criminal husband was locked in a federal cage, and her father's powerful, untouchable empire now belonged entirely to the sister-in-law she had spent years relentlessly torturing. I watched her eyes dart back and forth wildly as her brain struggled to comprehend the massive scale of her total defeat. She stammered out a weak, pathetic denial, trying to tell me that my firm could not possibly own her family business. I calmly advised her to call her father right now and ask him who his new chief executive officer was. I looked Courtney up and down one final time, letting my eyes linger on her pale, trembling face. I told her that she was officially nothing more than a broke, unemployed liability. I stated clearly that her cheap, shallow thrift store personality simply did not fit my high-end corporate culture. I leaned in close so she could hear every single syllable over the sounds of the busy city traffic passing by the courthouse. I told her to go home and tell her father to expect immediate severe corporate restructuring, starting with the complete elimination of his ridiculous inflated salary. Courtney was completely paralyzed by shock, unable to form a single coherent word or mount any kind of defense. Her luxury handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the concrete steps with a dull, heavy thud. I turned my back on her shattered, weeping form and walked gracefully down the remaining stone steps toward my waiting town car. My private driver opened the heavy door, and I slid into the quiet, luxurious interior, leaving Courtney completely destroyed on the courthouse steps. The week passed in a blur of highly successful corporate acquisitions and endless quiet victories. I sat in my massive corner office late on a Friday evening watching the city lights slowly flicker to life across the dark skyline. The massive glass windows offered a perfect view of the empire I had built entirely on my own. My private desk phone began to ring, breaking the absolute peaceful silence of the room. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I picked up the heavy receiver and answered with my standard crisp, professional greeting. There was a long, heavy pause, filled with the distinct crackle and hum of a cheap public payphone. The sound of heavy traffic moving in the background painted a grim picture of a dark, wet street corner somewhere on the outer edge of the city. Then a weak, raspy voice broke through the static. It was Calvin. The former powerful patriarch sounded completely broken and unrecognizable. He was crying softly into the cheap plastic receiver, his words slurring together in absolute despair. He told me that he and Renee were freezing and entirely out of food in their terrible, decaying apartment. He begged me with a desperate, pathetic sob, asking for just enough loose change so they could buy 2 cheap bus tickets to go visit Vanessa in the federal penitentiary. I directed my private driver to take me to the exact address Calvin had desperately given me over the crackling payphone connection. The location was a decaying 24-hour diner sitting alone on the desolate outer edge of the city limits. The glowing neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting a harsh red light over the cracked, uneven pavement of the empty parking lot. I stepped out of my sleek black town car and told my driver to keep the engine running because I knew this final meeting would not take very long. I pushed open the smudged glass door, and the overwhelming heavy smell of stale coffee and greasy fried food immediately hit my senses. The diner was nearly empty except for a few tired truck drivers and the exhausted waitress wiping down the sticky counter. I scanned the dark, cramped booths and spotted my parents sitting in the very back corner. The visual transformation they had undergone in just a few short months was genuinely staggering to witness. The powerful, arrogant titans of high society were completely gone. Calvin looked like a fragile, hollow shell of his former self, wearing a faded gray sweater that hung loosely over his rapidly shrinking shoulders. His perfectly styled hair was now thin and completely white, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a chipped ceramic coffee mug. Renee sat right beside him, looking equally ravaged by their sudden extreme poverty. She wore absolutely no makeup, and her face was deeply lined with permanent exhaustion and bitter defeat. They both looked up as I approached the table, and I saw a desperate, pathetic spark of hope suddenly flash in their tired, sunken eyes. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth directly opposite them, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely neutral. Calvin leaned forward immediately, trying desperately to put on a fragile mask of paternal authority that simply no longer worked. He cleared his throat awkwardly and told me that they had been doing a lot of deep, painful soul searching since the massive eviction and the criminal trials. He looked down at his shaking hands and said he wanted to offer a sincere apology for how things had played out over the years. For a split second, I almost believed he had actually changed, but then the familiar toxic manipulation quickly bled into his carefully chosen words. Calvin looked up and told me that they only pushed me so hard because they always knew I had a core of solid steel, unlike my siblings. He claimed they were intentionally strict and demanding with me because they recognized my immense potential and knew I was strong enough to handle the immense pressure. He actively tried to rewrite 20 years of blatant emotional abuse and severe financial neglect as some kind of brilliant, twisted parenting strategy designed to build my resilience. Renee eagerly nodded along with his pathetic lies, leaning across the sticky table. She started crying softly, wiping her eyes with a cheap, thin paper napkin. She told me that their lives were completely destroyed, and they were barely surviving on food stamps in their terrible, cramped apartment. She whined about how cold it was and how the neighbors were loud and disrespectful. Then she begged me to forgive their minor parenting mistakes and pleaded for just a small monthly cash allowance so they could afford the expensive bus tickets to visit Vanessa in the federal penitentiary. I sat quietly in the dim booth, letting their desperate, calculated words hang heavily in the stale, greasy air. I looked at the two broken people sitting across from me, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing at all. There was no lingering anger, no burning desire for revenge, and definitely no sudden urge to rescue them from the grim consequences of their own horrific actions. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level as I carefully dismantled their pathetic fictional narrative piece by piece. I told Calvin that his attempt to rebrand decades of blatant favoritism and psychological cruelty as tough love was an absolute insult to my intelligence. I reminded them that they did not push me to be strong, but instead they actively tried to break my spirit every single day, just to make Andre and Vanessa look better by comparison. I stated clearly that my massive corporate success was achieved entirely in spite of their toxic parenting and absolutely not because of it. I looked directly at Renee and told her that I would not give them a single penny of my hard-earned money to comfort a convicted felon who had tried to destroy my life. I explained that they had spent their entire adult lives enabling Vanessa's extreme greed and Andre's massive criminal entitlement. I told them they were the ones who created those monsters, and now they were finally paying the ultimate price for their complete failure as parents. I watched the last remaining shreds of hope completely drain from their pale faces as they realized their final desperate manipulation tactic had spectacularly failed. Renee started sobbing much louder, burying her face in her trembling hands while Calvin stared blankly at the scratched table, completely paralyzed by the absolute finality of my words. I told them that I did not hate them, because holding on to hatred would require me to actually care about them, and they were simply not worth the emotional energy. I explained that they were officially strangers to me now, completely irrelevant to the beautiful, peaceful life I had built for myself. I stated with absolute cold certainty, that this would be the very last time they would ever see my face or hear my voice. I told them that my corporate lawyers had strict, explicit instructions to immediately file severe harassment charges if they ever attempted to contact me or approach my properties again. The cold, heavy finality of my decision settled over the booth, completely suffocating their last pathetic attempts to argue or beg. I stood up from the cracked vinyl seat and smoothly straightened the front of my expensive tailored jacket. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my pocket and dropped it lightly onto the sticky table to cover the cost of their black coffee. I did not say goodbye or offer any final parting words of false comfort. I simply turned my back on the two weeping figures and walked purposefully toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, toxic chain that had bound me to my abusive family for my entire life was officially severed forever. I slid into the back of my waiting car, feeling completely light and beautifully free, ready to finally live the rest of my life entirely on my own terms. 6 months passed since that final grim meeting in the cheap roadside diner. The cold, dark winter slowly melted away, and my life moved forward with incredible, breathtaking speed and absolute crystal clarity. I no longer had to hide my massive corporate success or pretend to be the weak, invisible sister my toxic family had desperately wanted me to be. The time for hiding in the quiet shadows was officially over. I was finally ready to show the entire world exactly who I was and what I had built from nothing. The massive grand ballroom at the legendary Plaza Hotel in New York City was absolutely overflowing with the most powerful elite figures in global finance and international real estate. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided smoothly across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of expensive vintage champagne and delicate gourmet appetizers. The room was decorated with stark, elegant modern displays reflecting the massive, highly anticipated public rebrand of my corporate empire. I was hosting this lavish, highly publicized gala to officially step out of the shadows and announce my position as the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I stood near the edge of the main stage holding a simple crystal glass of sparkling water, completely surrounded by the people who actually mattered in my life. I was no longer isolated or alone. I was surrounded by my true chosen family. Julian Pierce stood right beside me, looking incredibly sharp in a custom-tailored black tuxedo. His warm, steady presence had been a constant source of genuine support through the absolute darkest chapters of my life. Eleanor, my brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney, was laughing loudly with my top financial executives and the loyal industry mentors who had quietly guided me during those difficult early years when I was living in a tiny, cramped apartment eating cheap noodles. These people did not care about toxic family bloodlines or fake inherited social status. They only cared about mutual respect, absolute integrity, and actual hard work. They had stood by my side when I had absolutely nothing, and now we were all standing together at the very pinnacle of the business world. I looked around the glowing, magnificent room, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace and absolute belonging that I had never once felt inside my parents' sprawling, empty mansion. The heavy murmurs and bright laughter of the crowded room slowly faded into a respectful, absolute silence as the main event began. Julian gave my hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze before I confidently walked up the carpeted steps and took my place behind the clear glass podium. Hundreds of bright white camera flashes instantly illuminated the dark room, capturing my face for the front pages of major global financial publications. The flashing lights reflected off the grand crystal chandeliers, throwing glittering rainbows across the painted ceiling. I looked out over the sea of powerful industry leaders, wealthy investors, and eager journalists, and I delivered a deeply personal, powerful keynote address. My voice echoed loudly and clearly through the massive speakers, carrying across the silent, captivated room. I spoke about the immense, undeniable value of building massive, lasting empires in absolute silence, while others wasted their precious time chasing cheap, shallow validation and fake social status. I talked passionately about completely redefining the true meaning of loyalty. explaining that real success is never simply inherited through toxic, abusive family bloodlines, but earned through relentless, grueling determination and unwavering personal integrity. I looked out at the faces of my loyal colleagues and shared how I had to completely shatter the fake, toxic illusions of my painful past to build a solid, unshakable future on my own terms. I told the crowd that true power does not come from tearing others down or stealing their achievements, but from having the quiet, brutal strength to walk away from the people who hold you back. I spoke about vision and resilience, declaring that Apex Holdings would always prioritize authentic innovation over hollow corporate greed. When I finally finished my speech, taking a slight respectful bow, the entire grand ballroom erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. The thunderous sound of hundreds of people cheering for my vision echoed loudly off the high gilded walls, shaking the very foundation of the room. I stood there bathing in the warm, brilliant light of my ultimate triumph, feeling completely whole and entirely unstoppable. The endless years of silent suffering and hiding my true potential were completely washed away by the overwhelming wave of genuine respect from my true peers. Thousands of miles away in a bleak, isolated concrete federal penitentiary, the scene played out very differently. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights flickered erratically over the dreary, depressing prison recreation room, where dozens of exhausted inmates sat, slumped in cheap, cracked plastic chairs. The air was thick with the foul smell of cheap industrial bleach and stale sweat. High up on the gray cinder block wall, a tiny mounted television screen broadcast the live national financial news network. The blurry, low-resolution screen was currently showing the bright, glamorous footage of my highly publicized gala in New York, showing my triumphant, glowing face speaking to the entire world. Vanessa sat completely alone in the very back row, wearing her faded, scratchy orange prison jumpsuit. Her previously perfect, expensive hair was now a greasy, unwashed mess, pulled back into a tight, severe knot. Her face was pale, gaunt, and deeply lined with severe exhaustion and miserable defeat. Her thin, shaking hands gripped the hard plastic edges of her cheap chair so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She stared up at the tiny, blurry television screen, helplessly watching me stand at the absolute pinnacle of global success, while she was trapped inside a cold, miserable concrete cage. There was no expensive designer makeup to hide the deep, bitter, ugly resentment twisting her features into a permanent snarl. She was completely seething with a raw, violent, powerless rage violently shaking in her seat as the terrible, crushing reality of her miserable existence finally set in. She was a convicted federal felon, stripped of all her stolen wealth and fake elite status, with absolutely no one left to manipulate or control. She had to sit there in that cold, smelling room, listening to the distant, muffled cheers of the crowd celebrating my massive, undeniable victory. As the news anchor praised my brilliance and my rapidly expanding billionaire empire, Vanessa let out a low, agonizing sound of pure, miserable defeat, realizing she would spend the next 5 long years of her ruined, pathetic life watching my massive, unstoppable rise from the absolute bottom of the world. The bright, flashing lights of my New York gala eventually faded into the quiet, satisfying reality of my new daily life. As I continued to build my massive corporate empire, the people who had tried to destroy me were slowly suffocating under the crushing weight of their own terrible choices. 6 months passed since that glorious, triumphant night, and the massive financial consequences of the family downfall became completely permanent. Calvin and Renee were finally forced to face the brutal, humiliating reality of the real world. Their massive bank accounts were entirely drained by endless legal fees and massive federal restitution fines. The sprawling, expensive estate they used to proudly parade around was sold off to pay their massive, crippling debts, leaving them with absolutely nothing. I received quiet updates from my private investigators detailing their pathetic new lives. Calvin, the former terrifying patriarch who used to terrorize corporate boardrooms, was now wearing a cheap, bright blue vest, working as a front door greeter at a massive discount retail chain. He spent his long, exhausting 8-hour shifts standing on hard concrete floors, forced to offer cheerful, pathetic smiles to the exact same working class people he had spent his entire life brutally mocking. His knees ached, and his back was permanently bowed under the weight of his total failure. Renee suffered an even more public humiliation. The woman who had obsessed over expensive designer silk and exclusive high society luncheons was now employed at a cheap fast fashion outlet. She spent her days mindlessly folding massive piles of synthetic cheap clothing under harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. Her former wealthy friends completely abandoned her, turning their backs the moment her bank accounts ran dry. Whenever she spotted a familiar face from her old country club days, she would desperately duck behind the cheap clothing racks, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming shame of her massive, undeniable downfall. Courtney's prestigious family suffered an equally spectacular and highly public destruction. When my company aggressively swallowed her father's massive construction empire, we did not just take their money, we completely stripped them of their elite, untouchable social armor. Without their massive inflated wealth to protect them, they were instantly discarded by the brutal high society circles they had always worshipped. The elite country club where Courtney had spent her entire life parading around and acting like royalty quietly and ruthlessly revoked their exclusive membership. There was no grand, dramatic confrontation, just a cold, polite letter delivered by a courier informing them that their presence was no longer required or welcome. Courtney was forced to quietly sell off her massive collection of luxury designer handbags and expensive imported shoes just to keep her small rented apartment. She spent her days furiously scrolling through social media, watching her former best friends attend lavish tropical weddings and exclusive charity galas that she was no longer invited to. The massive, glittering social empire she thought she had successfully conquered had completely chewed her up and spit her out, leaving her entirely forgotten. Far away from the bright city lights, Andre was living out his own personal hell inside the bleak gray walls of a federal penitentiary. The arrogant golden boy, who used to casually throw away thousands of dollars on single hands of blackjack, was now reduced to the absolute lowest rung of the prison hierarchy. He was stripped of his expensive tailored suits and forced to wear an itchy, faded prison uniform. His days consisted of waking up before dawn to push a heavy, dripping mop across the sticky, filthy floors of the massive prison cafeteria. He spent hours scrubbing spilled food and grime while enduring the harsh, mocking laughter of the other hardened inmates. There were no expensive sports cars or luxury vacations to escape to. There was only the endless, agonizing routine of hard manual labor and the terrifying realization that he had completely ruined his own life out of pure, greedy stupidity. He had to sit in his tiny concrete cell every single night staring at the blank gray ceiling, knowing that he would be drowning in massive, crippling debt for the rest of his natural life, even after he was finally released. While they all rotted in their own custom-built prisons, I sat peacefully in my massive luxury penthouse, high above the bustling streets of Manhattan. The evening sun was slowly setting over the incredible city skyline, casting a warm golden glow across my expansive, sleek, modern office. The walls were lined with pristine glass, and the floors were made of dark, expensive hardwood. I sat at my massive polished marble desk, surrounded by absolute perfect silence. There was no toxic screaming, no manipulative crying, and absolutely no one trying to tear me down. I picked up my heavy custom gold pen and pulled a thick stack of complex legal documents toward me. This was not another aggressive corporate acquisition or a ruthless hostile takeover. This was the final beautiful piece of my massive victory. I carefully signed my name at the bottom of the last page, officially establishing a multi-million-dollar private scholarship fund. I specifically designed the massive educational trust to fully support underprivileged, talented youth who had been completely disowned or abandoned by their toxic, abusive families. I wanted to ensure that brilliant, capable kids who were thrown away like garbage would always have the powerful, massive financial backing they needed to build their own empires. I was not doing it for cheap public relations or fake media praise. I was doing it because I knew exactly what it felt like to be told I was completely worthless, and I wanted to use my massive, unstoppable power to permanently rewrite that narrative for thousands of other forgotten survivors. I set the heavy pen down and closed the leather-bound folder, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute completion. The heavy oak doors of my private office opened quietly, and Julian strolled in carrying two delicate crystal glasses and an expensive bottle of vintage chilled champagne. He looked completely at ease, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit and a relaxed, genuine smile. He walked over to my marble desk and smoothly popped the cork, pouring the bubbling golden liquid into the crystal glasses. He handed one to me and leaned back against the edge of the large desk, looking out at the incredible glittering city lights spreading for miles in every direction. He took a slow sip of his champagne and asked me in a soft, amused voice if I was ready for the next acquisition boss. I held my crystal glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingers, and I turned my chair to look out at the beautiful, towering skyscrapers of the city I had successfully conquered. I thought about the broken, crying family I had left completely behind, and the massive, shining future I was actively building. I looked back at Julian, letting a slow, confident smile spread across my face. I took a sip of the expensive champagne and told him that I was just getting started. The greatest lesson here is that true family is never defined by bloodlines, but by mutual respect and genuine support. Sometimes the people supposed to protect you cause the most pain. Walking away from toxic relationships is not an act of surrender, but a powerful declaration of inner strength. When you stop seeking validation from those who drag you down, you create the space to build your own empire. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace and future? Share your journey in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories today.